Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine an amount of land so vast, it dwarfs the combined real estate of the Indian Railways and the entire armed forces. Seriously,
It's almost hard to picture, isn't it?
it really is. We're talking about Waqf properties in India. There are over 872,000 of them.
And the area is staggering, something like 39 lakh acres.
Exactly. Which is, what, about 5% of India's land?
Yep.
And the estimated value? Around $14.22 billion dollars, or 1.2 lakh crore. It's just colossal.
It really puts things in perspective, especially when you remember these are permanent dedications, often going back generations, meant for religious or charitable work. There's immense history there.
Absolutely. And that massive scale, that history, that's exactly why we're taking a deep dive today into the Waqf Amendment Act 2025.
Right, this new law is shaking things up a bit in terms of management.
Yeah, some pretty significant shifts. So we want to help everyone understand, what these changes are, and maybe more importantly, what they could actually mean on the ground.
Makes sense.
So maybe just for anyone less familiar, could you give us a quick rundown? What exactly is a Waqf?
Sure. So think of a walk as a permanent and irrevocable dedication. It can be property, land, buildings, even movable stuff dedicated by a Muslim for a purpose seen as pious, religious, or charitable under Muslim law.
Okay, permanent and
Well,
irrevocable.
that's key.
Hmm.
Once it's dedicated, the ownership in principle transfers to Allah. This means the property becomes inalienable.
Inalienable meaning.
Meaning it can't be sold, it can't be gifted, its core purpose can't really be changed, and it covers a huge range of things.
Right.
Well, the obvious ones: mosques, schools, graveyards, but also things like commercial spaces that generate income for charity, agricultural land, you name it. It's a very diverse portfolio.
Got it. So our mission today is basically to navigate this new legal stuff. We want to give a clear picture of this Waqf Amendment Act 2025, what it's trying to do, the actual changes, and the different ways people are seeing it.
Yeah, understand the objectives, the mechanics, and the reactions.
Exactly. Help everyone grasp what's really important here.
Yeah. And to really get the nuances of this new act, it probably helps to take a quick look back. How are these properties handled before? Because this isn't totally new territory for legislation.
That's a good point. The legal framework has evolved, hasn't it?
It certainly has. The first big one was the Waqf Act of 1954. That was really foundational. It set up the basic structure, establishing state RAC boards, SWBs, you'll hear them called. They got the job of overseeing and managing Waqf properties within their state boundaries. It was the start of organized management, really.
Okay, so 1954 laid the groundwork with the state boards. What came next?
Then we jump forward to the Waqf Act of 1995. This was much more comprehensive, and it actually replaced the 54 Act.
Aiming to modernize things.
Pretty much. Modernize administration, governance. A key thing it did was set up the Central Waqf Council, the CWC, for national level oversight.
Ah, so a central body.
Right. And the 95 Act also created Waqf tribunals, special courts basically, just to handle legal disputes about Waqf properties.
Okay, and then just before this latest 2025 Act, there was another tweak in 2013, right?
Exactly right. The Waqf Amendment Act, 2013. It brought in some quite specific changes.
Such as?
Well, for instance, it said the Waqf tribunals should have 3 members, making sure there was a proper judicial officer involved.
For legal expertise?
Precisely. It also mandated at least 2 women members on each state Waqf board. That was seen as a big step for gender representation. And importantly, it really hammered home the permanence of Waqf property by explicitly banning their sale, gifting, or exchange.
Okay, so that gives us the historical context. Building on that, let's get into the meat of the Waqf Amendment Act 2025. What are the headline changes?
Well, the very first thing actually is the name itself. The Waqf Act 1995 is now officially called the Unified Waqf Management, Empowerment, Efficiency, and Development Act 1995.
Wow, that's a mouthful. But Unified Empowerment, Efficiency, Development, those words definitely signal intent, don't they?
They certainly seem to lay out the government's stated goals.
So beyond the name, what are the concrete changes being rolled out?
Okay, one really significant shift is around how a property gets declared a Waqf in the first place. They've brought back stricter criteria.
Extra cow.
It now requires that only a practicing Muslim, and they define that as someone practicing Islam for at least 5 years who is also the legal owner, can dedicate property. And crucially, they've removed the concept of Waqf by user.
Waqf by user. That sounds potentially significant. What did that mean, and why is removing it a big deal?
So Waqf by user basically allowed a property to be recognized as Waqf if the Muslim community had been using it for religious or charitable purposes for a really long time, even without a formal deed.
So based on long-standing use, not just paperwork.
Exactly. Removing it could potentially affect properties, maybe like an old village prayer space or something, that have been used for generations but don't have that formal documentation. Their status might now be uncertain.
I can see how that would raise questions for some places. Okay, what else is key in this new act?
Another very noticeable change is the mandatory inclusion of non-Muslim members.
On the Waqf boards?
Yes, on both the Central Waqf Council and the state Waqf boards. The act says there have to be at least 2 non-Muslim members on each.
2 non-Muslims. What's the official reason given for that?
The government's rationale is that it brings diverse perspectives, helps with efficient administration, smooth functioning. They stress it's for administrative purposes, not religious interference.
Okay, that's definitely a notable shift. What about the role of government officials? Any changes there?
Yes, definitely. District collectors or officers at the deputy collector level are getting a bigger role.
How so?
They'll now be involved in surveying Waqf properties. Before, that was mainly done by survey commissioners appointed by the Waqf boards.
So more direct government involvement in mapping these properties.
Right. And these officials will also investigate claims on properties identified as Waqf if there's also a claim that it's government land. So the state admin gets a more direct role in identification and potentially sorting out disputes.
Seems like a move towards more state oversight. What about tech? Any push for digitalization or transparency?
Oh, absolutely. That's a major focus. The Act mandates a central digital portal
For everything.
for registering and managing all Waqf properties across India. The idea is a single comprehensive database to improve tracking, oversight, transparency, accountability, all that.
And the property managers, the Mitawalis.
They get 6 months to get all the details of the properties they manage onto this central portal. It's a big push for digital records.
Yeah, a central database could certainly make managing these vast assets more efficient, you'd think. What about the money side? Audits, contributions.
Yep, changes there too. Audit reforms first. Any Waqf institution with an annual income over 1 lakh will now be audited by auditors appointed by the state government.
Okay, state-appointed auditors for larger institutions, for financial accountability.
That's the stated aim, yes, to ensure funds are managed properly. Also, the annual contribution that Waqf institutions have to pay to their Waqf boards, that's been reduced. It was 7%, now it's down to 5%.
Oh, interesting. That could ease the burden for some institutions, I suppose?
Potentially, yes.
Now, disputes. You mentioned the Waqf tribunals earlier. Any changes to how they operate?
Yes, their composition is changing. They'll now have a chairperson who is or was a district court judge.
Bringing judicial weight.
Exactly. And the other member will be an officer, current or former, of joint secretary rank to the state government, probably bringing administrative experience.
Okay, judge plus senior official and appeals.
There's now a clear timeline. You have 90 days to appeal a tribunal order to the High Court.
90 days. Clear process there. Now, you also touched on the Limitation Act earlier. That sounds quite technical, but potentially important.
It is. The Limitation Act, 1963, that's the law setting time limits for initiating legal action, right? Well, that act will now apply to claims about Waqf properties.
Meaning?
Meaning there's now a defined window, a deadline, for Waqf boards or individuals to file lawsuits, say, to reclaim encroached land or resolve other disputes.
So it might stop really old claims dragging on forever.
That's likely the goal, yes, legal finality. But the flip side is it could make it harder to reclaim property if the encroachment happened ages ago and no one took timely action. It adds time pressure.
Right, a potential double-edged sword. Are there any specific protections built in for certain groups or lands?
Yes, and this is quite significant. There's an explicit provision protecting tribal land rights.
How so?
The law clearly states that land or property owned by any Adivasi, any tribal person, cannot be appropriated by the Waqf board.
Okay, that's a strong safeguard. Seems aimed at preventing any misuse concerning Adivasi land.
It appears so, yes. A clear protection for historically marginalized communities and their land rights.
And you also mentioned something about women's rights in family waqfs.
Indeed. This looks like a positive step for gender justice within those specific types of waqfs, called waqf al-awlad.
What does it do?
It basically ensures that women receive their rightful inheritance under Muslim personal law before one of these family benefit waqfs is set up.
So inheritance first.
Yes. It specifically mentions protecting the rights of widows, divorced women, and orphans in these situations. The aim seems to be stopping family waqfs being created in a way that might cut out female heirs from their inheritance.
That sounds like a really important provision for fairness within families. Okay, and lastly, you said an old law was repealed.
Yes, the Musliman Waqf Act 1923, it was a colonial-era law. Repealing it is part of consolidating everything under the amended 1995 Act, making the legal framework more unified and modern.
Okay, so that covers the main features. It's a lot of changes. But as we hinted, this hasn't exactly been welcomed universally. What are the main controversies, the big concerns people are raising?
Well, as you suspected, the inclusion of non-Muslims on the Waqf boards is definitely a major point of friction.
Are the concern there?
Some Muslim organizations see it as opening the door to undue government influence over religious property management.
A fear of losing autonomy.
Essentially, yes. Worries that it could make properties more vulnerable to, say, government takeover or disputes. The argument is that managing religious endowments should really stay within the community.
I can see that perspective, given the nature of Waqf. What about the bigger role for officials like district collectors?
That's also John criticism. The worry is that giving these government officials more power to decide on disputed Waqf property ownership could open the door to political interference.
Potential for bias.
That's the concern. That decisions might be influenced by politics or that the officials might lack deep understanding of Waqf law and traditions.
Okay. And the removal of Waqf by user. What's the main worry associated with that change?
The big concern is about those properties, maybe especially in rural areas, that have been used by the community for religious purposes for decades, maybe generations, but lack formal deeds.
The ones we talked about earlier.
Exactly. By removing the by user recognition, these long-standing community assets could potentially lose their Waqf status. That makes them vulnerable to encroachment or being sold off or used for something else entirely. It could really impact local communities.
Yeah, that sounds like you could hit hard at the grassroots level. And the Limitation Act. While it aims for efficiency, you mentioned a downside.
Right. The concern is that it might put Waqf boards at a disadvantage, especially if they're not well-resourced legally. If they can't act within the new time limits to reclaim land encroached upon long ago.
They could lose it for good.
That's the potential risk, yes. They might permanently lose control over those assets.
So definitely a complex picture. Potential upsides, but some really significant concerns being voiced too. How has this played out on the ground since the act came in? What reactions have we seen?
Well, there's been quite a bit of activity, and reactions are definitely mixed. We've seen reports of protests in various places. West Bengal seems to be a focal point.
Protests turning violent sometimes.
Sadly, yes, there have been reports of violence, which led to central forces being deployed in some areas. And politically, the chief minister of West Bengal has come out strongly against implementing the law in her state.
Wow, okay. That signals pretty strong political opposition. How has the central government responded to all this?
Prime Minister Modi has robustly defended the changes. He's argued the law is needed to stop the exploitation of poor Muslims and prevent misuse of Waqf properties by, as he put it, land mafias.
And he mentioned specific cases.
Yes, he mentioned receiving letters, particularly from Muslim widows, detailing injustices related to Waqf properties. He cited these as a key reason for the reforms, stressing the need to protect vulnerable people.
Okay. And the opposition parties in general, what's their take?
They've largely been critical, often framing the bill as discriminatory, potentially a tool to target minorities. They tend to echo the concerns about government overreach and the impact on the autonomy of these religious institutions.
Right. It's clearly a very charged issue, politically and socially. So, if we try and boil it down, what are the main takeaways from this whole deep dive into the Waqf Amendment Act 2025?
I think there are two main strands. First, you have the government's stated objectives: better management, more transparency, accountability, making things more efficient. Plus, the elements of inclusivity, non-Muslim members, protecting women's inheritance, protecting tribal land.
Okay, the modernization and fairnesses argument?
Kind of, yes. And second, you have the significant points of disagreement. These center on worries about increased government control over religious matters, the potential negative impact on traditional ways Waqf properties have been recognized and managed, and concerns about protecting these assets effectively under the new rules.
So it really comes down to that tension.
Exactly. That delicate balance between needing effective modern governance for these huge assets and respecting the religious autonomy and traditions associated with Waqf.
Absolutely. It's incredibly complex with such a long history. And As we said at the start, just the sheer scale of these properties makes any changes hugely significant.
It really does. And it leaves you wondering, doesn't it? How does this balance between, religious freedom and the practical need for good governance play out when you're talking about assets this important to communities?
Right.
What will the real long-term impacts of these amendments actually be on the ground?
That's the big question, isn't it? Something definitely to keep watching.